Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and welcome to MSU-Billings. I am so thrilled to be one of the co-hosts of tonight's Royal Johnson Forum as we commemorate 50 years of the Montana State Constitution. We are thrilled to be supporters. We are thrilled to have you on our campus this evening and look forward to tonight's celebration. Thank you so much to the Yellowstone Public Radio and Library Foundation for putting this all together tonight. And I also want to express my appreciation to Community 7 for recording this evening's panel. We have some special guests here, and these panelists are fantastic. And so the opportunity for us all to be able to be here and listen to them is a true gift. As you know, former U.S. Ambassador to China and former U.S. Senator Max Baucus is with us. Former Montana Governor Mark Roscoe, former Montana State Representative Dorothy Bradley, and Constitution Convention Delegate Mannan Ellington is with us, as well as Montana political reporter Chuck Johnson. So it's going to be pretty fabulous. Our moderator this evening is John Stepanek, and many of you may already know him, and I've been listening to stories this evening, so it's going to be a true pleasure. It is now my opportunity to turn the mic over to the Billings Library Foundation Board Chair, Danelle. Danelle?
Thank you, Chancellor. We are so lucky to be here tonight among some of the luminaries here in our state. It's already been an amazing day, and I am so happy to welcome you and to celebrate you for being part of the Royal Johnson Forum. We are really proud to welcome you to this celebration of our state's Constitution. And we're gathering tonight to discuss the importance of this foundational document. The program tonight will be in two parts. The first part, our moderator will have questions prepared that he will be asking our panelists. The second part, we will use questions that come from you. So as you were coming in, you may have seen there was a table with index cards. If you didn't get one and you want to write a question, just raise your hand and members of the board will come by and give you an index card to write down a question you would like the panel to answer. We also want to remind you at the very back in the hall, we have a raffle. Did you see the raffle? You can get gift certificates from Toucan Gallery, from Zest, and Paris, Montana. So, not to be missed. And also, I think they even had a few extra copies of our state constitution. So if you want to have your very own copy, check out the table in the back. Now I would like to introduce you to this evening's moderator, retired news editor for KVEQ, John Stepanek.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to start with something that I like to do at every forum that I've been to in the last 10 years, and that is this. I'm guilty as anybody, but if you would please take a quick look and go to silent, we'd appreciate it. Thank you. Well, good evening and welcome to Petro Theater here on the campus of Montana State University Billings. We are indeed thankful for this opportunity to gather tonight with you. This distinguished panel is joining us as well to discuss a transformative moment in Montana history, the Montana Constitutional Convention of 1972. It was the crafting of that document by a group of 100 extraordinarily ordinary citizens that changed the path of governing in our state. Again, as was mentioned, I'm John Stepanek. For 28 years, I worked with the Montana Television Network as news director of KTVQ TV here in Billings. And we have a wealth of knowledge and inspiration on our panel up here tonight. I will introduce them with just a brief bio. That was also mentioned briefly before us, but it will not come close to the full picture of their accomplishments. Senator Max Baucus, the longest-serving U.S. Senator in Montana, 35 years in Washington, fresh out of Stanford Law School, where he served as executive director of the Constitutional Convention in '72. Maynan Ellingson. Maynan served as the youngest delegate and one of 19 women who participated in the '72 convention. She also graduated from Law School in 1975. Mark Roscoe was elected 21st governor of Montana in 1992, later served as the chairman of the Republican National Committee. He was studying law at in 1972. Dorothy Bradley has spent her life working for Montanans. She was only 24 and already a state legislator when the 1972 convention convened. Dorothy was elected to 8 terms in the Montana House. And Chuck Johnson, a journalist who has covered Montana politics for more than 4 decades. He has covered 22 Montana legislative sessions and provided meticulous coverage of the 1972 convention as a much younger reporter for the AP. He was 23 or 24, 23 years old when he was there. But I also have to say I was very proud when he received an honorary doctorate from Montana State University this past spring. Yes. Please join me in welcoming a very distinguished panel. So for you, the panel, I want to direct questions to you individually. I'm also going to encourage that you jump in and add context to any of the dialogue that we have tonight. But I also want to start at the beginning, literally, the opening words of the adopted Constitution, the preamble. I find it to be a wonderful piece of writing. It was co-written by one of our panelists, Maynan Ellingson. And Maynan would be the first to give a shout out to the late Bob Campbell of Missoula. We lost Bob just this past spring. You know, the preamble does touch how many of us felt at the time and still feel about our great state. It reads, "We, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, do ordain and establish this Constitution." Our first question to the panel tonight is to Maynan. Can you please give us some insight into the writing of the preamble with the late Bob Campbell?
That's good question, hard answer. We wrote a delegate proposal for this preamble maybe about a quarter of a way into the convention. And one of the things that we were both struck by, and I particularly was struck by, were my fellow delegates. Tori Johnson from down in the Powder River country. And in the early days of the convention, he would get up and say, "I'm Tori Johnson, and I'm from God's country." And then Carl Davis from Dillon, Montana, in the early days, he'd get up and say, "I'm Carl Davis, I'm from God's country." And Mags Osheim from way up in Antelope, Montana, he would get up and say the very same thing. And it occurred to us that one of the things that was binding this group together was the love of place, the love of the physical characteristics of this state. And two things I think flowed from that. One, the right to a clean and healthful environment and natural resources article that Dorothy's going to talk about later. But secondly, the fact that we were all in this state, we all had as a single goal, really, to do exactly what the preamble said, to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and secure the blessings of liberty. And I must say, in deference to Bob, our proposal initially started out, we the people of Montana, grateful to our Creator, because we did want to pay some homage to the Native Americans who had lived here before. But once the proposal got to the Bill of Rights Committee, they were pretty sure if we took God out of the preamble, the Constitution wouldn't be passed. So they changed it to God, and I love our preamble, and I think it's one of the things that unites us as people.
Thank you, Mainan. Now, Mark, you have been known to turn a pretty good phrase or two. I know that over the years of working with you. Give us your assessment of the preamble.
It's awe-inspiring. It's poetry. And it is so elegant in every detail that you cannot improve upon it, and it's something that you remember eternally. So I think it's inspired, of course, by that creator and by our collective admiration and love for the state that we share.
Thanks, Mark. The first Montana Constitution was passed in 1889. It was Copper King William Clark presiding. And then almost a century later, it was time to break free from the outdated and suffocating Constitution in favor of a new framework designed for the people. Mark, I'm going to ask you first. Let's set the groundwork for the importance of a state constitution. Why is it important to have this guideline for how government and the people will conduct its business? And how important is a well-crafted document for people to really thrive in a civilized society?
It's good for me to remember that a constitution is a social contract between the people and their government. It's done with the consent of the governed. Each of us make an equal pledge and a promise to one another to serve each other faithfully and with fidelity, to serve the state and the United States with fidelity. And that fidelity really is translated to the kind of virtues that were meant to be embedded in the Constitution. The United States Constitution, which wasn't anticipated at all when they convened in Philadelphia in 1787, ultimately producing the Constitution of the United States of America, relied upon the moving cause and the moving force behind that Constitution to be relied upon virtue. And by virtue, I mean those kinds of timeless values that all of us recognize: a respect for one another, a presumption of innocence with one another, a refusal to make premature judgments until such time as there was sufficient information and evidence available. All of those things that have been normally a part of our communications and our governance structure were meant to be embedded in that Constitution. So we make a promise to each other, and we do that with fidelity. And it took a long time to get to the point to where we even contemplated a constitution in the United States of America. If you think for a moment, this all began with humankind, with the law of the jungle. And there was experimentation over 2,500 years with different forms of government, theocracies, oligarchies, monarchies, despots, tyrants of every sort, from the beginning of time, recorded history, until we came to that point in 1787. So it was a long, painful struggle, and it was not easily done. There were high prices paid by so many of our forebears. And at the end of the day, I think that's one of the things that we have to remember is that each of us is engaged. We can't be deluded by the notion that somehow the government is them. The government is us, those of us who own it, who shape it, who form it, who hope for its best process and procedure. So without a constitution, which, by the way, was a precondition for admission to the Union, we have no guide, we have no benchmarks to make certain that we are proceeding in a direction that ultimately serves all of us well. I might also add that a constitution is based upon a lot of compromise. I would suspect that tonight you will hear about those compromises that were made. Ultimately being faithful to the nation, not to a political party, not to a moving cause, but to the state and to the United States of America. In both our Constitution and the Constitution of the United States, that is required by a solemn oath. And as a consequence, unless we all begin with the understanding of how hard it was to get here, we really don't have a lot of choices if our democracy fails. We tried virtually everything else. It took 5 years for our forebears to come to a conclusion about the Articles of Confederation. 5 years. And frankly, all it did was provide for a league of friendship. That didn't pay the bills for the Revolutionary War. It didn't settle disputes. It was virtually nothing more than a friendship pact. And as a consequence, we found out that we could not govern ourselves without a fundamental document upon which all of us subscribe and impose upon ourselves through a process of self-discipline and faithful to one another.
Chuck, I'm going to have you take us back now 50 years ago. And 1972 doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was 50 years ago. And you were a graduate student at UM and an AP reporter and doing very well. You were in your mid-20s. I want you to get us to 1972 and to try to capture why was that the right time for this convention to happen and to change the face of Montana?
The 1960s were a very important decade in Montana. We had kind of a clunky state government from the 1889 Constitution. The executive had no power, really. The governor couldn't appoint cabinet members. The departments were run by boards and commissions, and a governor got control of the boards in year 4. It's like the livestock department is today. We had a legislative branch that was ranked, I think, 9th worst in the country. They met for 60 calendar days. If they took a Sunday off, that counted against them. They never could finish on time, so they'd put paper towels or butcher paper over the clock and work till they finished, till someone sued over that. So we had this kind of clunky structure. In the mid-60s, there were a couple of US Supreme Court decisions that involved one person, one vote. And the one that really made a difference in Montana was Reynolds v. Sims. And it held that both branches of both houses in the legislature needed to be apportioned on the basis of population. Prior to that, each county had a senator. So Yellowstone County with 80,000 people then had one senator. Petroleum County with 800 people had one senator. So you had a legislature that was pretty much controlled by rural interests. You had a legislature that was widely thought to be pretty much a handmaiden of the Anaconda Company and Montana Power and the railroads. Not much got done. And so in the 60s as well, you had things like the women's movement. You had the peace movement, protests against the Vietnam War. The first Earth Day was in 1970. You had civil rights movement. You had labor unions were pretty strong. So there was a push once urban counties got more seats in the Senate to try to reform this government that really couldn't do much of anything about any issues. That's when it all happened. And the legislature put a call for a constitutional convention on the ballot in 1970, and it passed. 65% of the people approved it. So, and then there was a long series of studies and so on to prepare for the convention.
So the voters of Montana then did decide that they wanted a change in our state constitution. And we went about electing 100 people to represent us at the convention that began in January of 1972. And I'm going to open this up to the entire panel. The convention of 100 citizens did not include politicians or elected officials. It included farmers, ranchers, lawyers, business people, educators, stay-at-home moms, a beekeeper. It really was a cross-section of Montanans from all over the state. I'd like to just have you all, who wants to jump in here, tell us about the mix of people who were brought together for the 1972 convention. Dorothy, can you jump in?
A very quick word about that. It was determined that legislators couldn't run to be constitutional
And
delegates.
you were one.
I was a legislator
Yes.
in 1971.
Yeah.
And that may be the best thing that ever happened, because there's a lot of legislators there thinking, this can't possibly take place without our vast knowledge. But they didn't want to give up their seat. And so it was a whole new day and a whole new slate. And we went in 1971 from me being the only woman in the House and Tony Roselle being the only woman in the Senate to being almost 1/5 of the delegates from women, that were women. And they were all new. They were open slates to be written on. And they did this incredibly different job. They didn't operate the way the legislature did. They made their own rules. It was a whole new day, and it was amazing. And I think that sent them off to a good start.
Mainan, you were a graduate student at the time and the youngest delegate elected. Did you know what you were in for?
Well, whatever it was, I worked really hard to be prepared. And the state of Montana, the legislature and a commission, they spent a year and a half of producing documents, studies, treatises, so that every delegate, even when we were running for office, knew what a constitution should be, all of the considerations. There were other states that were writing their constitutions at the same time. So even though this was a new group of people, it was not an uneducated group of people. And what really happened is that these 19 women, a couple of them may have been stay-at-home moms, but these were women who were on city councils, they were mayors, they were on county commissions, they were on boards, they were involved also through the League of Women Voters and the University Women's Association. They were ready for this opportunity to not have to run against an incumbent. And so you just really, it's amazing the contribution of these women, but it's really important to just not think of them as housewives or people who had not been engaged in the political goings-on in Montana. If it had not been for the League of Women Voters, we probably wouldn't have even had the call for a constitutional convention. Lucille Spear, a fellow delegate from Missoula, who is in her 70s, wrote an article for the League called We the People that set forth why we really needed to have a constitutional convention. So I just don't think you can underestimate the impact that women had, whether they were in the convention itself or whether they were helping bring it about. One other point I think that's really relevant to Dorothy's comment about legislators not being able to run, I heard lobbyists say that this constitutional convention group was about the hardest group that they had ever tried to lobby. And part of that was that they didn't have like this direct contact with people that they would have had from the legislature. And so we were all new. We didn't know who all of the powerful and influential lobbyists were. And frankly, I think we were really not very inclined to be lobbied. And they really didn't know how. I mean, they had never had 19 women to deal with. And I think that made a huge difference, the ineffectiveness of the traditional lobby in Helena.
The preparation was very important, though. And Max, you played a role in that and were there when the delegates came and were preparing to be part of it. Tell us, and again, if you want to tell us about some of the folks or the mix of people that you saw, but then how were they getting prepared to take on this enormous task?
Well, first I want to underline the point that Dorothy made, and added too. In many respects, I think the Montana Supreme Court saved the Constitutional Convention by deciding earlier that legislators could not be delegates, nor could they run for office subsequently. That allowed the delegates there to focus on the job and not pursue their political careers. Focus on the job. And they were so unified and so excited to be there. In addition, as you basically said, I mean, Ann has alluded to it, the staff, I think, did a terrific job preparing the delegates. The executive director is a guy named Dale Harris. I also think he was essential to the passage, to the success of the Constitutional Convention. Brilliant guy. He organized all the staffs for all the committees. And these staff, they were just aces. Man, were they smart. They were as dedicated as the delegates. And they prepared delegates with alternatives. This is what State X does, this State Y does on this subject, so you can pick and choose. And there are a lot of debates, obviously, within the committees as to what makes sense, what doesn't make sense here. In addition to that, we all know, but it's worth repeating here. About 58 delegates ran and got elected as Democrats. I think about 36 or so as Republicans and 6 independents.
Right.
Well, guess what? Nobody knew that after they arrived because everybody was seated alphabetically. And when I was there working there, my job was, the title was committee coordinator. Then when Dale Harris left, I took over his job. But it's clear to me how well Dale Harris put the group together and helped delegates answer. Now, because I was not a delegate, because delegates were sitting alphabetically, they were just, there's no partisan politics involved. There just wasn't any. Zero, zip. They ran as Democrats, Republicans, but certainly didn't serve. They're just delegates. And all this, I think, is very important when we remember that although all 100 delegates signed at the end, signed up for the convention, when it came time to passing it, Montana voters trying to figure out whether to vote for this thing or not, only 12 counties voted in favor.
Right.
And about only 25, it passed by about 2,500 votes, roughly. And some of the delegates afterwards campaigned against it. But in my judgment, it's a combination of the Supreme Court's decision, delegates being seated alphabetically, as well as terrific preparation. And because all signed, and they worked there in the spirit of the preamble, which you mentioned and many have mentioned. It was the guiding principle, the spirit that kind of pervaded throughout the convention. It's going to be difficult to have one of these again. I don't think in our lifetime we will, but we're lucky that we had it back then. It's also important to remember, and I just want to just very briefly touch on what Chuck said. You know, state executives in Montana were powerless. We had 102 separate executive boards prior to that. And, you know, the governor couldn't do anything. You know, Mark, you would have had a hell of a time. You pull your hair out and dealing with all these boards if you were governor back then. And the same thing, the 89 Constitution severely limited the powers of the legislature. You could only act in certain areas. So it was a nothing burger. It was just a mess. And also, not to be partisan about this, but don't forget, in the 70s, we had Democratic senators, and basically the delegation was Democratic. Mike Mansfield, Lee Metcalf, and Forrest Anderson, and so forth. That kind of helped a little bit, I think, to help put this together.
Mark, do you want the challenge of running in 72 or 68?
No, I don't want to challenge the ambassador. But I would add that the seating and the allocation of chairmanships of the committees being evenly split, even though there are almost twice as many Democrats as Republicans, instantaneously, in my view, observing the process from a little distance while I was in school, established trust and confidence. It was almost immediate. And people sitting next to each other in alphabetical order, without regard to any other classification or criteria, again, another step that established trust between the delegates almost instantaneously. It's just somewhat like tonight, in a way, when people gather and meet and we're in each other's presence. We're all watching one another, our habits, our listening to our discussions, and there's something almost mystical that binds us together as a result of being in the same room at the same time, focused upon the same issues. And I think that very much was what happened with the formation of the Constitution. There was a spirit of cooperation and a spirit of commitment to doing the best that could possibly be done for the people of Montana, not one individual cause, not a singular objective, but to provide a document that was eternal, if it could be, over the course of time, serving the best interest of the people of Montana. So the delegates were incredibly wise to proceed in the fashion that they did, because they provided the very opportunity for our better angels to manifest throughout that entire 54 days that our delegates met.
I think it's important very important, this alphabetical seating. I want everybody to jump in. Maynan, Dorothy, then Chuck.
Okay. I'm going to jump in on three separate fronts. One, when Senator Baucus was talking, Max was talking about the incredible preparation for this convention. It was university students from all of our campuses and from the law school. And dear Royal Johnson's son, Blake, was the research analyst for Revenue and Taxation Committee, but the research was done by our students, and that was so important. The alphabetical seating, you know, I think it's interesting, a lot of the languages, they were seated alphabetically. The truth is, we decided to seat ourselves alphabetically. And we did that for a couple of reasons. It was interesting during the election for delegates. In Missoula County, there were 64 people vying for 8 seats. There was intense interest in serving on this constitutional convention. People really wanted to do it. Missoula, for example, and Billings is a great example too. Missoula elected 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 4 women, 4 men. The oldest delegate, Lucille Spear at 73, the youngest delegate, me. But neither party in the run-up or in the election took any position on what this Constitution should say. They just didn't take any position. So there was really no reason to have partisan identification. The only party caucus that occurred, and I think Chuck observed it, was at the beginning when they were trying to decide who would lead the convention. Another really interesting thing about why the delegates said, of course we're going to seat ourselves alphabetically, is that there were 6 independents, and they said, what are you going to do with us if you decide to have Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other? We were elected just the same as you all, and just that leavening effect of these independents really just sealed the deal in us seating ourselves alphabetically.
Okay, Dorothy?
One of my roles here tonight is because of my age. I served before the Constitution and after the Constitution, and that gives me a very interesting perspective. Not so much about the thing that I'm going to say now, but some of us did take heed in how this structure helped get things through with a bigger block of support than the way we are doing things in the legislature. It took me many years to get the trust of the Appropriations Committee Chairman, Francis Bardno from Harlow, Montana, to let me chair the Subcommittee on Human Services. And he was very wary about me and thought I was going to give away the bank with my bleeding heart. And he used to sit in the back of the room and watch everything I did. But I told him and promised him that the committee I wanted would be equal senators and equal representatives, which is traditional, and equal Republicans and equal Democrats, and that was not traditional. I did not want to get to the end of the session and have this enormous fight over whether there was too much money going to disabled children versus nursing homes or anything else. I said I want the most conservative pick of the whole lot. And all I can say is that it worked. We would never pass money out of that committee unless both parties had an agreement on it, because if there wasn't, it would be a tie. And so when it would come to the end of the session and everybody would want to bash the budget and take it out of this and that, I mean, this committee had all the money. When you compare human services to anything else, it had all the money. They all hung together. And when they directed us to take money out, we'd all sit down and work it out together. And there was never a battle. So all I'm going to say is this system works. It worked like a charm. And it's really a blooming shame that they don't do that now, that they load up their committees and battle it out and sharpen their knives and fight each other. And that doesn't work. Working together to figure the expenditures out is what works. And the other thing is, I have marveled for years about what is this expression that's now even in the national television is about the aisle. They're on the other side of the aisle. And I always laugh at that because in my last session when I introduced, as a Democrat, I introduced a sales tax, which I still believe in. And we had more Democrats than Republicans, so they put me over on the other side of the aisle. And I always said it's just because I'm so agreeable, I can work with everybody. But everyone knew it was because I was doing something the Democrats didn't like very much. But what I learned over on the other side of the aisle is all these wonderful people that were over there. My seatmate, a crusty rancher from our valley, said, I hope you're going to retire pretty soon because I have to keep running every year that you do so I can cancel your vote. And we were friends. And you know, if we can't do that in the political system, I don't know where we are. We need to have a lot more of that. And the rules, Mainan, that you developed were so good, and we should push everybody to embrace them.
Chuck, I know you wanted to weigh in.
I think the total number of Montanans who ran for seats to be CONCON delegates topped 500, which is phenomenal. There were huge numbers of people in every county that ran, way more than usually run for the legislature. So there was great public interest. Along the same lines, the delegates did something that I don't believe the legislature's ever done. They solicited proposals from the public and got 1,500 of them. And they were subject to hearings just like a delegate proposal. And those got a lot of attention. Some of them were included, some weren't. But I remember going to cover one that I thought was an interesting idea, and I knew it would be one that would have strong feelings on both sides. But a woman from Alberton proposed a right to die to be in the Montana Constitution. Her father was terminally ill and wanted to die. Well, I wrote up my story, and at about 11 o'clock, an AP editor from Queens called and wanted me to reach people. And of course, no one could be reached at that time, but there was great interest in it, but it didn't pass. But they did solicit ideas from anyone and everyone. And I think it'd be a great idea for the legislature to do the same.
We're going to jump into a little bit more of the nuance of some of the key provisions. And Dorothy, I'm going to start with you. One of the most important was that idea of the right to a clean and healthful environment. And that certainly took a lot of discussion, and there was not perfect agreement on this. So let's discuss the right to a clean and healthful environment. It's unique to Montana and a few other states. What did it cover, and why was it important to get that provision into the document? And did they get it right, Dorothy?
Well, I think they did a beautiful job, and Mainan, who's been sort of correcting me on the fringe today of facts that I sort of fuzz up a little bit, please leap in. But I had my Constitution in the car, and it's in the car seat tonight. But we have clean and healthful environment in two places in the Constitution. One is the Declaration of Rights, and it's under oh, thank you. Mine's highlighted, though. It's under inalienable, so I can find it. It's under inalienable rights. And what I love about the phrase in the Declaration of Rights, that it also says, and corresponding responsibilities. I wonder if any other constitutions say anything like that, you know, this is also on us. And then you get down to Article 9 and the environmental article, and it says, and each shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment. And Mainan has a wonderful story about how Delegate Campbell was debating about clean and healthful and just what you were going to get there and what was the right word, and it was very contentious. And for a while there, it was just hanging in the balance. It was this right to an environment. Had no clean and healthful in there, just that each shall have a clean and healthful environment. I always loved that story, and finally they got it right, and I think they did great. And you can imagine that it was contentious because everyone's thinking is what kind of litigation is going to come blowing out of the state for all of this. There's two things I want to mention about this because it deals with things that the legislature had to do once the Constitution was written. We had to implement it. It is, as Mainan has always said, the skeleton. It is the body of the law, and then you have to flesh out all the little things. And that's what we are trying to do. And it was the most joyous task, the most monumental task of a lifetime, but one was water rights. Water, the coin of the realm these days. I mean, we have too little. And at the time the Constitution passed, we had nothing. We had absolutely nothing. There was nothing to prevent, limit, or even record water use. All you had to do was start using it. And everybody knew, my God, we're the headwaters state, we better do something big. So the Constitution confirms existing rights. That's one thing, and it does a number of other things, but it also provides for the regulation of water rights. I know that that set everybody on edge. You've got the legislature, you've got the state involved in our water. But the amazing thing is at that point, our water rights were all in little shoe boxes on index cards in county courthouses. That is absolutely where they were. This put together a situation in the state where we were putting together a centralized database. This is going to be the decade of fighting for water, and we're the headwaters. And thank goodness for the delegates who put in place that we're going to understand whose rights we have and quantify them as to how much they are. We'd be in a terrible pickle if it weren't for what they did, and then later the legislature setting up the water court. And then I had to say one other incredible story, which is just one of my favorites. There was an eruption of environmental laws coming out of the 70s. It wasn't so much implementing the Constitution as being carried by the wave of that beautiful preamble and the rights that were laid out in the different articles. And it was a most prolific time. I did put together, with the help of 20 writers, the stories that came out of that time. You can find that book with the law school if you're prone to look for it. But I think of all the 20 stories, my favorite is from Harrison Fagg from your community, who took a walk in his beloved Beartooth Mountains and getting up onto a high plateau found that they had ripped up the entire plateau in order to explore for certain minerals with no regulations, took everything in their path, no requirements that anything be repaired. And he said, this cannot be. And he put together a group to write and then pass the Hard Rock Reclamation Act. This man can look back on his life, and he's in his 90s now and still kayaking down the Smith River. He can look back and say, this wouldn't have happened but for me. And he did it in the way we all dream of, but we can come back to if we desire. He said, my first co-sponsor will be Dorothy Bradley because she's a Democrat, and he was a very conservative businessman from this very community. And it was bipartisan every step of the way. And he brought in a mining engineer lawyer, and he brought in an environmental lawyer, and he said, write this law. No other state had this law. He had nothing to base his commitment on. He was just forming it out of clean air, and it passed, and it's good, and it maintains to this day. So don't ever think that what you do is not important, because it is.
And Chuck, that provision, thank you, Dorothy, that was wonderful. That was a tough vote. I mean, the clean and healthful environment idea didn't get passed until late into the evening one night, wasn't that correct?
Yeah, and Maynann can probably tell the story better than I can with Bob Campbell, but do you want to do it, Maynann?
Go ahead. You'll be briefer.
Yeah, I am watching the clock here.
Well, Bob had tried to get it through earlier, and it failed. And he got up and said, you know, if a kid stops us on the street and asks what you did over at the Constitutional Convention, we'll say, well, yeah, we have an environment. And he said that'll be a great joke for North Dakotans to tell. He tried to get it through and it failed. And it looked like the right to a clean and healthful environment was not going to pass. And Bob told the story that he got a note from Leo Graybill, the presiding officer, try your motion again. And this, some time had elapsed, and it was late in the evening. And Bob tried it again, thinking it was a goner, and lo and behold, it passed by a decent margin. And I don't know to this date what happened, but I think there must have been some arm twisting by delegates of other delegates, and maybe Maynanne can elaborate on that.
Well, we just kept trying different language. I had a proposal, Don Foster had a proposal, and each one, as they kept going through, were getting closer and closer. So, I mean, as John, you mentioned, it went on into the night, and there were a dozen votes on different provisions to the right to a clean and healthful environment. And ultimately, I really think Bob's humor was somebody had moved to take out clean and healthful out of the proposal. They had moved to remove that, and the way it stood, we're going to have an environment. And
Every day.
every day, day in day. And I think at that point, people were just a little bit ashamed of the shenanigans and the smoke screens. I mean, they were saying, well, what will a clean environment be? What will healthful? You're just inviting all kinds of litigation. But at that point, there was federal legislation with respect to clean water and clean air where those terms were used constantly. So it was just a smoke screen. And I'll be darned if it weren't the lawyers who were really trying to pull those smoke screens mostly.
Okay.
Is that when you had the interchange with Wade to Hood?
That would be it, yes.
I got to tell that story. It's one of my best memories. Me and Anna was on the floor promoting the provision, going on what a great idea this was.
Yeah, clean and healthful environment.
Yeah. And Wade to Hood from Anaconda, a very colorful trial lawyer, wonderful guy, just loved him to death. He stood up and said, now, Ms. Robinson, now, just how are you going to enforce this? What are you going to do? How do you make this work? And right away, without skipping a beat, me and said, well, first thing, I'm sure not going to hire you to be my attorney. It just brought the house down. I've never heard the delegates laugh so loudly as when that exchange happened.
That's where I wanted to go next because the Constitutional Convention was full of characters. And I want to have each of you, we don't have all that much time to wrap this part up, but I wanted you to pick one person. I'm just going to name a few. Bob Campbell, Louise Cross, Chet Blaylock, Leo Graybill, Wade DeHood I had on my list. I've never heard anybody talk louder in a room than Wade. Dale Harris, Dorothy Eck, George Harper, Betty Babcock. Those are a list of some, but I'm going to let each of you pick one. Max, I'll start with you.
All right.
Pick one of your favorites. It might be Wade. And let's go down the line and tell us just a brief story of each and why you choose them.
Mine would be Maynanne. She was one of the best. No, really, I was going to mention somebody else who's not really come up here very much, and that's the president of the convention, Leo Graybill. He also is responsible for the success of the convention. He was strong, he was tough, he was penurious. The budget, I think, was $488,000 for the entire convention. He watched every single penny, make sure it was done over his spend. I forgot about papers or the copier. He did something, recycled. I don't know what he did, but he was very, very careful to make sure nothing is wasted. And the convention came up with $80,000 surplus.
And then the 60
Sorry?
day, and the 60 day thing.
Yeah, during that time. But one little small story. I worked for Leo, and we were putting the budget together. And I forgot the lady's name who's helping us out, the person with staff. Well, it just didn't balance. The numbers just didn't work. We'd overspent someplace. And Leo said, don't worry about it, cross it out. We're just going to say it anyway. So he marched off on the floor and told delegates, everything's perfect, everything's nice. Well, it wasn't. But it was a small point that didn't make much difference. I don't know how much time we have tonight, but I do want to make one point. We're up here extolling the virtues of the Constitution. It's an amazing document. But it's important to remember, I think, that it's a living document. It's not static. As you know, the Constitution provides every 20 years to split up the voters. And the first time was 1990, I think it was. 1990, only 18 people, 18% said, yeah, we need a new Constitution. Then 20 years later, about 30 or 40% said we need a new Constitution. So it's not quite as shiny as many of the things. But my more specific point is this. It's a living document. It really depends upon all of us as Montanans today, not 1972, but today, and how we embrace it, work with it, and utilize it. And different people have different objectives. The U.S. Supreme Court, in the Dobbs decision, essentially said, okay, it's up to states to determine abortion law. They punted. It's all back to states. So it's back to Montana now, as well as other states. And I mention that because it's, for those of you who care about this issue, and I think most of us do, there are three very important elections coming up this November. One is the Montana Supreme Court. It's clear to me that there are some who want to change the composition of the Montana Supreme Court. So the Montana Supreme Court comes up with a Dobbs-like decision. Second, under the Constitution, our state Constitution, if 100 legislators, total both parties, 100 out of the total, want to propose an amendment to the Constitution, it's up before the voters in the next election. Well, guess what? We're only 2 votes shy of 100. And so this coming November, there could be people elected, have certain points of view that dramatically affect right to privacy. Our Constitution has a right to privacy, but it's a little ambiguous as the degree to which Montanans who care about a choice is protected vis-a-vis the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's these elections count.
Yes, they do.
They certainly count on in this case too. And there'll be many other instances where this great document that we all are a part of is going to be tested. It's going to be utilized by some people who have certain points of view. So it's important for all of us to keep in mind that it's really up to us, as many in the panel have said. By us, I mean the voters, Montanans, to really care, watch all this, and get the facts, and find out what's going on, because there could be some significant changes to the Constitution.
Okay, let me jump in. I'm going to have to put you guys on notice that it's a less than a minute answer. I'm going to go back
Less than a minute?
Less than a minute to tell me who was your favorite character
Okay, all right.
at the convention. Go, minute.
Okay, my favorite character was my seatmate, Arlene Reichert, who's 96 years old. She spoke in Helena and got a standing ovation. I'm going to take my other half minute on a personal note to tell you that the Billings elected delegate, Dave Drum, made all the difference in my life because he enabled me to go to law school. After seeing me work at the convention, he sent someone over and said, she needs to go to law school and I will help her. And your guy, Dave Drum, made that happen for me. And I understand he made those kind of things happen for other people.
Salute Dave. All right, Mark, top that one.
Well, I think Wade DeHood would have to rise to the top in terms of characters, if that's the classification. He wore the most fashionable suits. He was exquisitely attired. He was bombastic in his rhetoric, and he was incredibly persuasive. But every step of the way, he was lovable and charming.
Yep.
Dorothy?
Mine would be Dorothy Eck. We were almost next door neighbors and very close family friends. I never would have had a political life without her. She encouraged me to do that. But she showed me the deal about follow through. She was with the League of Voters that created this. She was elected as a delegate. She was under Tom Judge, Governor Tom Judge, the head of local government, trying to work out the provisions in the Constitution for local government, and then a senator for many, many years. There's somewhere in my background, I remember the phrase that a good idea is 5% of it, and execution of that idea is 95%. She was both.
Yes. Chuck?
I'm going to mention Betty Babcock. Betty was pretty conservative and voted against a lot of the provisions. And the delegates saved on their budget and saved some money to run an education campaign after the convention ended to try to tell Montana voters what was in the document. That's
true.
A lawsuit occurred to block that spending. And Betty Babcock said, no problem. Tim and I own the Colonial Inn, Colonial Hotel. We've got office space, typewriters, photocopy machines, and phones. So that became the headquarters. And so I think without Betty doing that, I'm not sure the voters would have approved of the document, because that's where that was the campaign hub and the headquarters.
We just have 2 minutes to go, folks. So I have to think that this was one of the proudest moments of your lifetime. If you look back at your participation, can I assume that? Can you reflect on what being part of the Montana Constitution in '72 means to you today?
I
Okay,
just
I'll
feel,
begin. Because
I
I'm
just
in.
feel grateful
No,
I
that-
didn't
I was
screw
in
up
the
the
field.
opportunities. That's it.
For me, it's the spirit of the camaraderie, joy, service of 100 people is doing the right thing and for the right reasons and being very happy doing it. It's something I always remember in everything I do in public service, harken back to that. It's a good lodestar. It's a good guide.
Mainann?
Well, it's certainly the most important thing that ever happened to me. It was the most influential period of my life, and as I mentioned, I was able to go to law school as a result of it and have a really wonderful legal career that has kept me grounded in our state constitution, the federal constitution, state and local government, and I'm just forever grateful for the opportunity and feel an obligation, of course, to my other 99 delegates to continue to try to tell the story of this Constitution.
And Chuck, I'm going to answer for you, yes. This was...
Biggest story I ever covered.
All right. Please join me in thanking our panel tonight. Max, Mainann, Mark, Dorothy, and Chuck.
I thought I'd know too.
And thank you. This event co-hosted by the Library Foundation, MSU-Billings, and Yellowstone Public Radio.
Are you sure we didn't have an hour and a half?
We do, because we just finished up live on the radio. Did you see their countdown clock went right to 0, and now we move on. We have questions to go to now, and we're excited about that. First of all, also, pause, and thank you again for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to get back together again and have discourse about any number of topics. And again, thanks to our distinguished panel tonight. You ready to go? How many amendments have been presented to voters in the past 50 years? How many have passed? And do you recall some of them?
Well,
How many amendments to the Constitution?
over 100 have been offered. Significantly fewer than that have passed. There have been 3 constitutional initiatives that have been passed. There have been some really good amendments to the Constitution, like setting up the Coke Severance Tax Trust Fund, the Resource Indemnity Trust Fund. There are some amendments that happened right after the passage of the Constitution that I thought took us back the other way, and that was we had enacted annual sessions in order to try to strengthen the legislature. So almost immediately, the legislature proposed a referendum to go back to biennial sessions. I think that was a mistake. There was an amendment to term limits, which I think has weakened the legislative branch and resulted in less collegiality among the legislators. Another amendment that I think has been very disappointing to me, and it's one that I think kind of slipped through in 2004, and it ends up in a very interesting place in our Constitution in Article 13 that says the state will never recognize marriage unless it's between a man and a woman. So on the one hand, we have probably the most progressive Bill of Rights, Declaration of Rights, individual rights and privacies, but we have that amendment to our Constitution. Nevertheless, this Constitution has been amended less frequently. That is, the amendments that have been proposed have not been adopted less frequently than any of the other constitutions of the same generation.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on an amendment that has been brought forward? Let me go to, if you could change one thing in the Constitution, what would you change?
Nothing. Other than perhaps the provision that Maynard just mentioned.
Yeah, I would try to amend that, that's for sure.
One of the things I did want to bring up and that I would say was a miss, the convention had inclusivity in mind for race, religion, and individual rights, but there were no Native American delegates elected to serve. The convention did end up deciding on an educational goal to preserve the cultural integrity of the American Indian. Indian education was passed and has just recently been implemented. Was that a miss? I know the fact that there were no Native American delegates elected may have been because of the counties electing each delegate. Can you help me out there, Chuck?
I think that's exactly what happened. Unlike one of the things the Constitutional Convention did was put in single-member districts. And the way the Indian reservations were, they were a fraction in a county, so no Native Americans got elected. I think it's unfortunate, pretty astounding, although in the previous legislative session, 71, there was one Native American, Percy DeWolf from Cutbank. So I don't think many Native Americans were running, in part possibly because they didn't think they had a chance.
But they do today. Or much better chance, for sure.
Yeah,
Because of single-member districts.
Exactly.
And I think we should just give a shout out to our former Congresswoman, Jeanette Rankin, who came to speak to the delegates at age 92. And the one thing that she argued for vociferously was single-member districts, because she felt that it encouraged more people to run because it was less costly to have a campaign in a small district. She felt it would foster more minority representation. And after she spoke, and in the legislative committee on which I serve, there was really very little doubt that single-member districts would be one of the defining provisions of the legislative article.
Okay, the next one I'm going to throw out to all of you, and I think that this may take up the rest of our time. What specific systems and practices do you think are primarily contributing to our national polarization? And give us some solutions that you see to this growing problem. Mark, I'm going to let you go first. Solve our nation's problem.
Well, there might be a note of humor at the beginning, but my belief is that there are ominous and perilous signs of difficulty confronting our constitutions, both at the state and federal level, and that we simply cannot take for granted that everything will remain the same, that we can depend upon these foundational documents, that we can depend upon the contract that we have between us as the governed and our government, if we're not all engaged in defending them vigorously and constantly. There was a poll taken not long ago that revealed that 1/3 of us, 34% of the people in America, believe that it's appropriate to bring violence against the government on occasion. There was one that followed shortly thereafter by National Public Radio, where 70% of the people declared that they believed the United States of America, its Constitution, and the individual states were in decline. So the notion that maybe some of you here tonight have visited in your quiet moments and wondered about, that we are confronted with a dilemma of some significant and huge proportion, is correct. I've had the chance to visit with people, as all of us have, across the state of Montana, and I would say that there is a massive number of people who are concerned about whether or not we're falling apart. And as a consequence of that, defense of the Constitution at the national and at our state level is an absolute priority for each and every one of us. I think there was a time when I took it for granted, and having grown up in the 60s and the 70s, watching the new Constitution come into existence, I believed that it would always be there. We would always be there. But the fact of the matter is, these are ominous moments, and I think that's what we confront more than anything, is the adhesive that holds us together, the faithfulness that our Constitution expects, the commitment to one another that's absolutely essential to a democracy, the virtue, the traditional values that are a part of our way of life are under threat. And it's going to take each and every one of us addressing that problem through requiring a higher and better performance, through defending our constitutions, through making certain that we plan our votes. It doesn't matter really what party you are to me anymore. What matters to me is whether or not you have character, whether or not I can trust you, either as a Democrat or a Republican, to try your level best. We can disagree on policy, but at the end of the day, if you have regard for the people you live with, if you see sometimes through your heart rather than just through your eyes, then you're my kind of candidate. And I think that's the challenge that we confront going forward, both to our Constitution and frankly to our Republic. All of you will recall, I'm certain, when Benjamin Franklin came out of Independence Hall, someone yelled a question at him and said, "What kind of a government do we have? A monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." That still remains the existential question of our time.
John,
I just thank you for bringing the right tone to that question. Mark, I appreciate it.
I just would like to add on a little bit to that, and something that Max said earlier. And I think the biggest threat facing us in Montana with respect to our Constitution is no longer a belief in the true separation of powers. The Constitution is a bunch of words, and it means ultimately what our Supreme Court says it means. And I think what we are seeing is we have a legislative branch that does not like the constraints that the Constitution puts on their actions. I mean, we see it in voting, for example. You've got to weigh those restrictions that they're putting on voting. The Montana Constitution puts popular sovereignty ahead of anything else. Yes, the legislature has the right to regulate elections and make sure that they are fair and just, but how far can they go without infringing on the right to vote? And you've just had the sample case here in Billings, where one of the Republican legislators who was voted out because she did not support the restrictions on voting. And she came out again and said in court that the Republicans didn't want students to be able to use their student ID card because students tended to be liberal and they didn't want them to vote. Yes, legislators can regulate elections, but they can't go so far as to deprive people unnecessarily of the rights. The courts are making these interpretations, and the legislature, or at least the legislative majority, is not liking what our courts are saying that our Constitution stands for. So the next step is to try to weaken or politicize the judiciary to make it more like the legislature. And we've seen at least 2 bills in the last 2 sessions, one which would require court members to run as either Republicans or Democrats. That was declared unconstitutional. No, I'm sorry, that didn't even make it out of the House. It was defeated. But then the other one was to require judges to run by district. The attempt there is to make the court more political. Though I think these are the biggest issues that we're facing in Montana, is to try to preserve the Constitution, try to preserve the separation of powers and the impartiality of the judicial branch of government.
Max, I'm going to go to you next.
Well, John, I think you've asked a fundamental question that's on the minds of a lot of Montanans and Americans. I hear it constantly. What's the answer? I'm asked. And we're all faced with that question. I'm not sure I have a single bullet answer. It's complicated, but it's here. It's where we are. A couple of things come to mind, though. Number one, we can begin at home with our friends, our family, and what groups we may belong to. You know, just be civil, be decent, ask questions, constructive questions, and pretty soon you'll find out that they have the same assumptions and premises that you have. Because we're all really looking for the same thing. What's that? Decent income, food at the table, take care of our kids, decent education. You know, it's not that complicated, really. Address air and water pollution, decent health care. You know, we all want the same kinds of things, really. I think we get wrapped around the axle too much about how we pursue them. Another answer to that question, it seems to me, is it reminds me of the Pogo cartoon. You know, I have met the enemy and he is us. I mean, you can't have somebody else do it for you. We ourselves, as people, got to figure out the answer to that solution. Sometimes when I think about all this, I think that it may have to get worse before it gets better. We may have to hit bottom before we as a country and people start to work better together. I don't know, hope not, but I've sometimes wondered if maybe that's going to be the case. Another approach to all this is this. We've got to remember, we're an amazing country, the United States of America. We're an amazing state, the state of Montana. We don't see people heading for the door that live in other countries. People want to come to America. That's why we have an immigration issue. We are still basically the beacon on the hill. It's a little bit of shine taken off a little bit with January 6th, et cetera. But still, we're kind of, not being too technical, that's one reason why the dollar is so strong. People invest in America. And there's a strong intrinsic bounce, I think, in our country. We're intrinsically able to do things. It's kind of hard to get there, but we do. When I was in the Senate, a lot of town meetings, and these kinds of questions would rise. What's the future of America, et cetera? And my answer was pretty basic, and I think it's still pretty true. If you look at the sweep of history, civilizations rise and fall. Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, even the UK. They were thousands-year-old countries, some of them. We're young. We're about 260, 270 years old. There's no guarantee that we're still going to be rising and growing and be the top of the heap. There's no guarantee in history. There's none. But what will help us do well? So we prolong our sense of America. I think there are two conditions. One, it's kind of corny, it's kind of trite, but I think it's true. It requires an educated electorate, and that's hard work. It's not easy. With social media today, it's too easy to not think critically. It's too easy to accept the other person's point of view without doing the research yourself and trying to figure out who's right and who's not right. The more we are educated as a people, the more we engage in critical thinking. I mean, just analyzing things, not being critical of somebody, but analyzing things, and be of good faith and goodwill. But know what we're doing. It helps. The second is once you kind of figured out what you think makes sense. My assumption is you come to a pretty good conclusion because you spent time thinking about it. Number two is then you got to do something about it. You can't just sit in your hands. You got to do something. Now there are elections coming up in November, and they have huge consequences. Now we all talked about the legislature's doing this, the court's doing that, and everything. Well, it kind of depends who the legislators are. It kind of depends who's on the Supreme Court. You know, we'll do well. I think we'll be able to address some of these terrible partisan divides in our country. The more we just find out what's going on and act on it.
Dorothy, I'm interested to hear your take on the polarization of America and ideas for solving some of the issues that we have.
I have nothing new. I stew over it every day, and I do a fair amount of ranting over what's going on, and my partner of 30 years, Dan, says if you keep that up, you're going to scare away all your friends. I feel like our two worst enemies are social media. It's something I don't understand very well because I don't even do it. And attached to that is all the fake facts. I have no idea what to do about that. And the second thing is a huge sense of powerlessness that's running through everybody. I mean, it's not, to me, it doesn't just seem like particular age groups, but it's sort of everybody. I always get upset with the young women because when I was a young woman, you couldn't have kept me away from these issues. It just pulled me in, and I gave it everything I had, and that I can see this now when they just say, oh, what difference does it make? I can't do anything. I mean, those two things I absolutely do not have answers for. It would seem to me, and I despair about this, that the thing that gets us revved up is a crisis. I hate that we are crisis-oriented, but the only thing I see going on right now that's absolutely huge on the political front is women's rage over what's happened with Roe. It's surprising all the pollsters, it's surprising everybody. It's not surprising me. I just think, why didn't you see this coming? Why didn't you help us stop this? It was written in the stars that this was coming down the pike. And I don't know, but this election, I will go back to what I did in 1970. I'll knock on doors, because I think it all comes out somehow in face-to-face conversations, trust if we can find it, knowing your neighbor. I think if we did a massive door-to-door contact mission, not a partisan mission, but maybe an issue mission in Montana, it might make a difference, and it's all I can think of.
Chuck, I know that you try to work in your journalistic career a balance of getting, if there are, both sides, but also fleshing out what is the truth. It's becoming more difficult along that realm. Tell us about your thoughts regarding the polarization of the country and the difficulty today in reporting on it.
I think voters should demand that their public officials and candidates debate face-to-face. Earlier today, Mark and Dorothy talked about debating forums and the like 33 times in 1992.
Wow.
Nowadays,
And it was a close election.
And nowadays, a lot of candidates they'll do one debate. I don't think Max ever turned down a debate. I don't think Mark Roscoe ever turned down a debate. Dorothy didn't. But it's so different now with campaign finances, millions and millions of dollars, dark money coming in. I don't know that this will ever happen, but I think we need to figure out a way to have public finance where each side gets the same amount of money, and we figure out a way to block the outside dirty money. It's a dream. I don't know that it'll ever happen, but I think the money really pollutes things, and the goodwill between candidates, the good debates gets rubbed out by nasty ads that lie about people, and no one can match the money. So those would be my hopes.
And do you think that it is more difficult today reporting? I know you're retired now, but from back when, in 72, say when you were doing convention work and working hard for the AP, to what today is trying to report truthfully in the media, how different is it?
Well, it's a lot different because there are a lot fewer reporters than there were back in those days. Secondly, the campaigns are longer. People start running a couple years in advance. And I think the campaigns are often nastier, not necessarily the two candidates, or three candidates, but the groups coming in and attacking them with ads or flyers or whatever. You know, we'll start getting the nasty, they call them slicks, the cardboard flyers that'll start showing up in our mailboxes in the next few days, because the ballots go out 30 days before the election, and they make a difference. People read those and think, oh, it must be true. I read it on this piece of paper, when they often aren't. And you know, we tried to do fact checking on ads, and it's a noble thing to do, but you can't begin to keep up with them. I mean, they'll come in, there'll be 20 different ones. No media in Montana can keep up with them, but I think we need to try, and we need to try to sort out the truth. That's our mission.
Okay, thank you. You know, I have a lot more questions from you, from me, but Leslie from the Billings Public Library Foundation just gave me the hook. So we're going to have to wrap up, but I want to make sure that we thank again our panel, Max, Maydan, Mark, Dorothy, Chuck. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope you enjoyed tonight's 2022 Royal Johnson Forum, Quality of Life, Equality of Opportunity. Again, our event hosted by the Library Foundation, MSU-Billings, and Yellowstone Public Radio, and a shout out to Community 7 TV. Thank you very much, everyone. It's great to see you tonight.
Thank you, John.